So martial arts and self-defense guru and legend Jeff Thompson has been quoted as saying that BJJ is rubbish for self-defense. But he's been misquoted and misunderstood a bit. In fact, he qualifies it a lot more than that. But this touches on something which is very relevant to HEMA, and that is, why do we find that some historical combat styles have fighting on the ground, ground fighting, and some don't? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and this is going to be touching on wrestling, self-defense, BJJ, also historical fighting styles, and the context of weapons. So first up, let's actually look at the context, the modern context of what Jeff Thompson is actually going on about and what he actually means by saying that BJJ is not necessarily a great self-defense strategy.
Not only, the other thing that happens on the ground is that's where the majority of the deaths and grievous bodily injury happen because of the stomping, the kicking and everything. And anybody stabbing, and anybody that understands group dynamics like that in a real environment, you know, outside of the ring, that's one of the most dangerous things that can happen to you. Not because it's a bad skill set to have, it's just
a great skill set, it's a great support system.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right, but you would never go to the ground because you always presume that the person you're fighting is carrying, he's got a weapon, because he usually has, and you always presume that he's either with somebody else, so there's 2 or 3 of them or more, or that I've ended up on the ground by mistake because I've made a mistake. And strangers have walked past and kicked me.
So fundamentally what he's saying is that in a self-defense situation, either with multiple opponents, on hard ground which might have glass or anything else on it, or indeed when there's weapons involved, could be anything from a battle axe all the way through to just a pocket knife. When anything like that is involved, or indeed, you know, bottles or sticks or bats, anything like that's involved, then ending up on the ground is not something you want to choose to be, you know, not somewhere you want to choose to be, not something you want to choose to do as a fighting strategy. It's not good self-defense. You want to stay on your feet. But very important to point out that Jeff is very candid about the fact that BJJ, which I've started dabbling in the world of recently, is actually a fantastic repertoire of skills. So learning the skills for fighting on the ground, BJJ style or any other style that does ground fighting, is a very useful thing to know. But you shouldn't necessarily, in fact you definitely shouldn't, choose to be on the ground in a self-defense situation, especially when weapons are involved. So how does this relate to historical European martial arts? Well, obviously HEMA, historical European martial arts sources, cover a massive period of time, starting from the medieval period, looking at things like arming swords and long swords, but also in that same period we see wrestling and grappling as well, of 2 types. I'll come back to that in a second. Also things like dagger, use of small shields, bucklers, pole weapons like spears or pole axes, and then it goes all the way through. We go through, you know, rapiers and side swords, small swords, sabres and so on. And in all of these European fighting systems we do see a lot of grappling. Now a lot of the grappling that we see is actually in the context of a weapon, so where there's a weapon involved and you're principally fencing or using the sword, but very often you will grab or wrap or throw or get into a full-on wrestle with a person in order to facilitate defeating them, okay, or incapacitating them at the very least. So there is a lot of, as you well know, regular viewers of this channel or similar channels will absolutely know this, there is an absolute ton of grabbing, grappling, disarming in armed martial arts in the European sort of body of knowledge. But in addition to that, there are pure wrestling sources, and these go all the way back to the end of the 14th century that we have surviving. Almost certainly we know that wrestling was a massive thing. For example, in English laws there are specific laws about wrestling outside of the city limits in the 13th century and even earlier in some cases. So we know that wrestling was a major thing, practiced as a sport, sometimes as a prize competition, and other striking arts as well, early forms of sort of what later would become boxing, but wrestling was really the main thing. So there were 2 types. I mentioned those 2 types of wrestling. So in the medieval period, there are 2 types of wrestling. This is being somewhat simplistic, but generally speaking, there's 2 types of wrestling. There is wrestling for war or self-defense, in other words, mortal wrestling, and then there's sport wrestling. Now, sport wrestling is what evolved into things like Westmoreland and Cumberland wrestling and catch wrestling and things like this. So there were specific rules, specific holds, and getting a person's shoulders to touch the ground, for example, might get you the win. In other cases, I guess, you know, in the BJJ context, that would be like a submission. But if we look at judo, in fact, judo has some similar kind of rules to some of the traditional European wrestling things. So there were specific criteria for winning. But obviously, if you're training to wrestle or grapple for war or self-defense, then anything goes. Weapons go, eye gouging goes, and, you know, breaking of digits, grabbing single fingers and breaking them, and all of this type of stuff, fish hooking. All of those things are allowed in that kind of mortal wrestling. So when we look at the historical European sources, we see sport wrestling sometimes and we see mortal wrestling sometimes. But here's the question: why do some sources, mostly German, why do some sources show ground wrestling? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So one reason we could say is just because sometimes people fall over, sometimes people fall on the ground, and just like learning BJJ, even if you're not going to seek fighting on the ground, even if you learn ground fighting, it's extremely useful to know it if it accidentally happens. So if you fall over, if the other person takes you to the ground, you know what to do on the ground, which will enable you, potentially, to get back up again and be back on your feet and potentially running away or doing whatever you need to do. So learning to get out of that situation is as important as how to get someone else into that situation. So that's the first reason. So just because it just happens by chance. Okay, but the second reason is really quite specific to some German sources, and that's to do with the judicial duel or trial by combat. So what was a judicial duel or trial by combat? Quite simply, it was where the courts had run their course and one person had claimed the God-given right to decide the matter under the eyes of God in combat with an opponent. And this could be at several levels. It could be a knightly judicial combat in armour, or it could be a common person's judicial combat. For example, in England and France, that was normally done with a shield and a wooden club with spikes on the end, basically like a plank with a nail in it. And in Germany, it was sometimes done with a large dueling shield and sometimes accompanied either by a sword like this, an arming sword, or with a club. So there were different types of judicial duel depending on what social status, and even men and women. You will have seen this, for example, Schola Gladiatoria done a video about it, where to even up the scale, the woman has a rock in a sock and the man has a club, and he has to stand in a pit. So there were ways of kind of making it more even if there was a physical disparity. And in a couple of notorious cases, even humans fought animals, where the animal was the accuser, or in one case the human was the accuser. Anyway, we'll look at that in another video. But essentially this was deciding a legal matter through the medium of combat, and anyone who's watched Game of Thrones will be familiar with this concept. So how does that relate to ground fighting? Well, quite simply, this is somewhat, at least in one way, akin to fighting in the octagon. That is, it is one person versus one person, and there's nobody else involved, and it's in a pre-prepared, limited area. So it's not on a pavement or concrete. It's there isn't broken glass lying around. There aren't other potential attackers. There aren't any other people with weapons who are just going to come along and stab you when you're on the ground. It's just mano a mano, or mano a pigo in one case, where it was man versus pig. But anyway, quite simply, it's one versus one. So that changes the scenario. So if it's a one versus one fight and it goes to the ground, and it has to be to the bitter end, as some sources describe it, it has to be to the death, or in some cases a submission, then ground fighting is more likely to happen. There is another situation where ground fighting, in my opinion, is more likely to happen, and that is borne out by what we see in the treatises from the time, and that is when armour is involved. Now, why should that be the case? Well, first of all, armour makes you invulnerable to an awful lot of attacks, okay? Quite simply, a standard sword cannot cut through plate armour, it can't thrust through it, it can only go for gaps, and there aren't many gaps. And even the gaps have mail, aka chainmail, in there as well. So it's very difficult to overcome armoured opponents who are completely covered in plate armour from head to foot. Literally from head to foot, okay? So that being the case, you often have to get them on the ground in order to get access to the small number of openings, and some of them are easier to access when the person's on the ground, like the crotch, for example. To get to those small number of openings, so in armoured fighting context, in armoured fighting sources, we see, I would argue, a little bit more ground fighting, partly because armour is involved. However, just to confuse matters, sometimes those sources are also looking at a knightly judicial duel, so it can be a double whammy. It can be, first of all, because it's a one-on-one fight, and secondly, because it's an armoured fight. And there's another reason why armoured fighting can lead to fighting on the ground, because you're more likely to fall over. Okay, and this is born out of bitter experience and observation of my friends who also do armoured training and armoured fighting stuff. You're more likely to end up on the ground in armour for a couple of reasons. One, because your just general agility and capacity to see and things like this is more impeded. You're more likely to trip, you're more likely to be thrown, this kind of stuff, but also your centre of gravity is higher. So whereas usually we're balanced around the middle, when you put plate armour on, your centre of gravity tends to raise a little bit higher than that. So you become a little bit easier to throw in certain ways, a bit harder in other ways, but anyway. So I think wearing armour makes it more likely you're going to go onto the ground, but also fighting against people in full armour makes it more likely you're going to want to get them on the ground. But not all sources show this. There are armoured sources which show a whole bunch of armoured techniques which do not show ground fighting. Why? It comes back to Jeff Thompson. If you are fully armoured, you don't want to end up on the floor, and it is a really, really bad place to be on the ground when someone's trying to stab you. And also, it's harder to get up off the ground when you're in armour as well. Ergo, BJJ or any type of ground fighting might not be great self-defence, but it is really good thing to learn to help you know what to do if you end up there and how to get back up from there. So fundamentally, Jeff Thompson is 100% correct. I completely agree with him. Of course, he is a man with a huge amount of wisdom and knowledge, but funnily enough, without him necessarily knowing it, what he says is also completely applicable to historical European martial arts, including armoured fighting, medieval battlefields, and even duels in the street, and to some extent, judicial duels as well. Anyway, I hope that's been thought-provoking. Do you disagree with anything I've said? That's absolutely fine. Get posting down below. Do you think there's some other aspects which I could have covered which I haven't covered in this video? I'm always interested to see that because that might lead to a future video. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about HEMA, armoured fighting, unarmoured fighting and European fighting traditions, why not come to Fight Camp, which is coming up at the last weekend of July. There's still tickets available. It's the biggest one ever because we've moved to a massive new venue. So check out the website. I'll link it down below, and hopefully I'll see lots of you who are watching this video. I know a lot of you have registered already, so I'll see more of you there hopefully. And there's going to be some other YouTubers you might recognise as well from other channels like Drakinifil and Blumeneck and various other people, Todd as well. Anyway, we'll see you there. If you can't make it, then obviously keep watching this channel because there will be videos coming out of that event. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I'll continue to be. Take care, folks.